Being recorded.
Yes, yes, now we are. Yes, we are.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to, I think it's the month of April, Schools Forum, which is, I think, is it the last forum of this municipal year?
Yes.
And the new the next one will be in the new municipal year. So we'll start with apologies for absence and substitutions. Cornelia?
Good evening, everyone. We have apologies for absence from Tony George in the academy category, from Marion Budd in the maintained house schools category, from Pete Broadbent in the voluntary aided and faith ethos academy category, from Iram Woolley, maintained primary schools category, and from Councillor Andrew Steed, who's a non-executive member of the council. And from the officers, we also have apologies from Helen Harding, who's the newly appointed Assistant Director for Early Help and Prevention.
Thanks, Cornelia. And we'd like to welcome Chris Richards, who's a new member of the forum from Villiers High Schools block, Villiers High School. Moving on to urgent matters. Anything to consider urgently? No? Matters to be considered in private? No? Declarations of interest. Has anyone got any declarations of interest other than being just generally interested? No updates? And to the minutes of the previous meeting. So if we check the first page, which is page 5.
Yes, I have a
A correction.
correction to make on the minutes attendance for January. Kimberly Herring was actually online. It does say that she was online, but it also says she was absent. So just to say, we'll delete the bit about her being absent. She was present online.
Thanks, Cornelia. Page 6. Page 7. Page 8. Page 9. And page 10. So we'll agree to approve those minutes. Yeah, and thank you to Cornelia for her diligence around the minutes. And over to membership. So we just have a couple of membership issues coming up. Cornelia, do you want to just speak about them?
Yeah, so there's been no change to the membership since the January meeting, but I just wanted to flag that in September, there are a few members' tenures coming to an end. So we will send letters seeking nominations later, before that point. So either later in the summer term or quite early in the autumn term. So just have it on your radar, please.
And in the interest of balance, not to prejudice any decisions, but just a note to the primary block members that it's important that there is a balance within the schools forum of representation, and it's important that primary colleagues, both head teachers and governors, do step forward. So if we could pass that message around. To the next item, which is the appointment of chair. Would anybody like to put themselves forward to be the chair of Ealing Schools Forum?
Nominate E.
Thank you very much for the honour, colleagues. And for the election of the vice chair, I'd like to put forward Jeremy Hannay. Would anybody like to second?
What happens if his membership is not renewed?
If what?
Well, you're one of the people.
What happens if what?
Well, like if on the 30th of September, you know, maybe you're not reelected. What happens then?
I have just been.
No, your
term of office
Time's up in
Oh, your
September.
term of office ends.
Your
in
term.
September.
Yeah,
Yours is on
Sorry, I'm lost. Yeah, but I thought that's what we were doing now.
You're ahead of yourself.
Sorry?
So that's your election for chair, but your term of office actually ends in.
I know it does,
September.
but the discussion that we had was that certainly with.
So nominations,
And then if you were re-elected in your position, you will remain the chair.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry.
So nominations are sought, and then if there are obviously more nominations than vacancies, then we'll go to election, but otherwise he would remain the chair as long as there's no opposition to his.
Cornelia and myself have already discussed it.
Appearing up in special schools, because you and I have been here for a while.
Since 1925. Ian. And I'm correct that the election of the vice chair is happening now.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, this was the Canadian way of the vice chair saying that he doesn't want to be the chair yet. That was what I was.
Oh, don't you fret, your time's coming. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So moving on to the main body of the report, I'm going to hand over to Kim.
Thank you, Paul. So the purpose of the April report is there's a number of purposes. So to seek approval from the Schools Forum for the scheme for financing schools for the 24-25 financial year, to provide the forum with a short update on the rollout of the early years extended entitlement, and to provide forum with an update on various matters relating to high needs. So we'll go through these areas in turn. So the first recommendations are around the scheme for financing schools. So the revised draft scheme is attached as Appendix 1. And the recommendations are that colleagues note the summary of changes, agree to the revised scheme coming into effect from 1st of April, and note if there are any further amendments following feedback. They'll be reported and considered at the next meeting. So this item starts at the bottom, towards the bottom of page 16. And as I say, the local authority are seeking approval of forum to publish the scheme. The scheme is substantially the same as the one approved for 23-24. At the point of writing the report, so the DFE, the scheme's based largely on the DFE's version of the scheme for financing schools and on the DFE's guidance. And that's republished every year at the end of March. So due to the timing of forum this year, the report was finalised a few days before the DFE published their updated guidance. So I said in the report that we'll share any updates from that guidance verbally at this meeting. So there were no directed revisions within the revised guidance, so nothing that we directed to have to include within our scheme. And there was one sort of key update to one section, so that was section 5.8 of the scheme, which is around borrowing by schools. And effectively the update is to reflect the introduction of the International Financial Reporting Standard 16, which ends the distinction between operating and finance leases. So it's around lease arrangements, and it reflects the Secretary of State providing blanket consent to a range of the most common leasing activities. So it's just a change of wording around that to reflect that update in the guidance, so in the legislation. And what we will do is update our section 5.8 in the scheme to reflect that key update in the final published version. So other than that, the scheme, as I say, is largely the same as the version for 23-24, just with date updates, etc. Within it, the updated scheme maintains the existing balance control mechanism for excess surplus balances. So forum members will remember that we had a question in the school funding consultation to ask school colleagues about whether they supported retaining the current incremental levels and the focus on schools who've built up an excessive and increasing balance over 2 consecutive years. And the feedback that came back through the funding consultation was that schools were, majority of schools were in support of us continuing with the focus of the scheme. So we've not made any changes to the scheme within to the mechanism within this scheme. And as normally happens, following the confirmation of the maintained school balances, which will report at the June meeting, the local authority will revert to forum to make a decision about whether to implement the mechanism for this year. So does anyone have any questions or things they want to pick up on that recommendation? Jeremy?
I recall maybe in the last 12 to 18 months, a kind of a memo coming out from the local authority around lease agreements and schools, telling us to, basically avoid them at all costs where possible and to consult with the local authority if we were to be entering into certain types of lease agreements. Is that what this amendment is referring to, or are those two separate things? Or am I completely off and that never happened?
Yeah, so it is around the same area. As I say, it's sort of the looking at the wording. Effectively, what the wording is saying is that the introduction of this new IFRS 16 means that so leases are classed as borrowing and require the Secretary of State for Education's consent. That the change is around sort of blanket consent for common leasing. But yeah, it kind of remains the position that that those arrangements would generally be in its sort of exceptional circumstances. So if you want to come in.
No, you covered it really well, Kim. It's related to the same thing, but those changes came in before the usual cycle of updating the scheme for financing schools. So that guidance was provided, and now the scheme is updated. But schools were expected to operate in that way in advance of that because the IFRS has been in place predates this, but those rules still apply.
Large scale leasing rather than small scale. I mean, that's not going to need any kind of Secretary of State level approval, one assumes, which is what it talks about in the.
Yeah, so I think that's the area that they're referring to around the blanket consent for the sort of.
So if you want to lease a photocopier, I imagine that's straightforward. But if you want to lease a building, that might be a bit different, maybe.
Yes, depending on the nature of the lease. So there have been historic and legacy issues around ICT, photocopying arrangements and leases. And so those types of leases would require additional approvals and would be unlikely to be agreed. But the usual kind of standard arrangements where there are very clear breaks and no kind of, 10-year arrangements that commit schools to hundreds of thousands of pounds, they would be, not agreed. Sorry.
And just to clarify, Kim, the balance control mechanism is included in the consultation every year, isn't it?
So it hasn't been previously, but we did include it in the consultation last year because forum members, we'd had to have the discussion and forum members wanted to understand the views of schools in terms of maintaining the current mechanism. So we can have a discussion at the June meeting about whether we want to include anything further in the consultation for in the autumn term. Yeah, so we need to do the decision. So as I say, the bit that needs agreement from forum is to agree to the revised scheme coming into effect from 1st of April 2024.
No, okay.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Okay, so the next recommendation is around early years. So the recommendation is to note the update on the rollout of the early years extended entitlements. So we flagged this and Sandy came along and gave some information on this at the previous forum meeting. The working parent 2-year-old offer is on track to go live. So will now have gone live. at the on the 1st of April. At the point of writing the report, we'd issued just over 900 eligibility codes under the scheme to Ealing resident children. So that and that those rollouts will continue over the course of this financial year. Following the feedback from during the early years funding consultations, so there was some feedback at those consultations that schools and PVI settings would welcome some more business support around the rollout area. So the local authority, it says are running. I think they were this week actually. There were 3 business support training sessions put on to offer support and guidance. So one for childminders and early years one for early years providers and one for schools, preparing for the extension to the early years funding. So the session for childminders and early years providers aim to provide sort of information on business health checks, budgets and planning for the future, while the session for schools was providing information on what the extensions could mean for schools and planning for change. So I don't have the information on how many schools came along to those sessions, but following on from those sessions, if that's something that it'd be helpful to put on again or put some other sessions on, we'll take that feedback and make some decisions about what else might be helpful. And then the intention is to provide a further update on sufficiency planning at the July meeting of the forum. Jeremy?
I think it might be helpful. I think over the years, one of the things that shifted, in the primary sector, I can speak for that, is just the number of offers that are on for schools, which is incredible, right? I mean, ALP's done an amazing job making sure that schools have access to content information, but there's a lot of stuff on. So I think what's happening is some of these sorts of things that are more on the business side of things are starting to get missed. And so maybe a slight strategy around, really funneling, pardon me, really funneling all the education, learning, teaching stuff through clusters, and then the businessy stuff through quadrants, might be a strategy that makes sure that the attention is given where the attention is needed. Because I think that there are probably a lot of schools who don't even know that they want to know about the 2-year-old rollout and in the year after, the earlier provision, because there's lots of information, lots of questions that people would have. But I think when we put on a bespoke session that falls outside of those streams, it can just become a lot because there's a lot of good stuff happening.
So yeah, we have, assuming it goes ahead, because we have the regulator visiting us over the coming weeks, but we have a schools consultative group planned. I think it's the 29th of April, so it will be on the agenda for that meeting. Thank you for the feedback. There are, I think most quadrants are covered. So if you as a quadrant would like to invite a representative from the early years service to attend quadrant to present information or share information, they'd be more than happy to do so. And we'll make sure that whatever the presentations were that were provided at those meetings are available and posted through kind of gatekeeping, so it's available to colleagues.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges working in that order is that, I was lucky, I led Southwell for a number of years, which meant that by the end of that tenure, I understood who to reach out to bring to the group. But in quadrants, very often it's a 1-year role, and that you don't quite know who to reach out to in that year. And so it almost needs to come in the opposite way, like someone needs to contact the quadrant leaders and say, hey, make some space for me in your meeting because it's important people hear about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're both agreeing, and I think what we're intending to do is flag it at the schools consultative group, and the quadrant chairs attend that group, and so we'll invite them to create space on their agenda at a time that those quadrant members would find it helpful.
So in trying to get a kind of benchmark on all of this, it seems to me, and I'm sure I'm completely wrong, but 900 eligibility codes doesn't seem a lot. Am I wrong or right? Or is it about uptake, or are there like 900 2-year-olds, or are there 2,900 2-year-olds?
So you're right, that figure is out of context. I think what we'll do in July is provide that context. So the portal to create they essentially have to have a code that they apply on the website that determines their eligibility so they can access the provision. Unfortunately, we don't have any early years colleagues here, and they probably can reel that off the top of their heads, but I don't have the numbers now. So we can feed back outside of the session, and we'll include it in the summer report if that's okay with colleagues.
Yeah,
So it's definitely not all 2-year-olds because there is an eligibility criteria.
absolutely. The only reason it kind of jumps out at me a bit is because sort of post-COVID, it has such material effects on child development and language acquisition and readiness for school. And if the uptake is low, it's worth us investing in it to address those lag issues.
Yeah.
It's, to me, it's actually a really, really important issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the last sentence in that section, that sufficiency planning update that we're planning to bring in July would cover the, essentially the detail around what proportion you'd expect to be taking up at this stage with a new rollout, what the targets the government is kind of setting, or the guided targets, how far away or not we are from them, and we'll get a sense of what that means to the overarching population of children that age.
And to note, so this is the working parent, it's the working parent 2-year-old offer that's being rolled out. So the disadvantaged 2-year-old offer was the offer that was already in place. I think what we don't know at this stage from that information is how many of those families were already accessing provision, and this is just them getting some funding that they weren't previously getting, and how much of that is new families. So some of that context is what we'll work through and report back through to forum.
I have a couple of questions. So if the 900 wasn't 900, if it was double that, is there capacity in the education system to handle 900 or 1800 or 2700, whatever it might be? And am I right in thinking that whatever that number is, it is going to be funded fully, so it's not coming out of existing resources, or does it have to be found from existing budget?
So there, from a funding perspective, this subsidises childcare provision. I suggest it doesn't fully fund childcare provision. Parents will be paying top-ups. A number of children will already be accessing provision that their parents are fully funding with this new entitlement rollout. What was the first part of your question, Ian? Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, and that's it might be.
There is that someone trying to come in on the online.
Yeah.
Yes, hi. It's Susan Dillon from representing the nurseries. Just to add on regard to 2-year-olds, myself and other settings we don't have the capacity to cater for the 2-year-olds. Lots of 2-year-olds are expressing interest, are looking for places. We just don't have the capacity. So, we do need to look at sort of, even though they've got the entitlement, how we can offer the 2-year-old places and where can we signpost them.
Thank you for your assistance, Susan. That's really helpful. And ultimately, that whole piece is the sufficiency planning. So we're preempting work that needs to be undertaken that we're planning to report back to forum. It's really helpful that forum members are interested, because early years at times isn't something that that is necessarily the focus of discussion. So we can bring that back in the summer term. So you can get a sense of the sufficiency planning. What I would say is matters for forum, ordinarily speaking, are related to funding. And so the early years sufficiency strategy sits presently with the new Assistant Director for Early Help, Helen Harding, who started this week. And so the governance arrangements around sufficiency planning, supporting the market to meet the level of demand and the statutory requirements for the area are not dealt with as matters for forum. So it's just to kind of frame the level of discussion we'd expect to have here. We're likely to signpost colleagues to, discussions that would be happening somewhere else.
But
Does that make sense?
It does make sense, Tamara, and it's very helpful. I suppose the thing that is directly related to Forum is, and I think that's sort of beneath one of your question, Ian, is the early years block. Is the 2-year-old grant funneled through the early years block, or is it a separate grant?
So yeah, it's part it's part of the early years block. And the funding formula rates set at a rate so that the funding formula is fully affordable within the block. The block is based on participation numbers. So it's updated based on different counts within the year. And so if there's a reduction in a lower take up than anticipated, or it goes up, then the funding will be adjusted for the local authority in the same vein. So we wouldn't expect there to be a pressure. And that's why when setting the early years block, there's a contingency element which you guys agreed. Who decided? The local authority decides on the early years funding formula, but it's in consultation with schools, and that came in January. So within the January report, you were presented with the different funding rates for the different types of provision, as well as the other commitments to the early years block. So contingency, which would fund any overs or any underspends, would increase the balance brought forward. Inclusion funding, various other aspects of the early years block. The funding formula is the vast majority of the commitment to the block, and that's why we model it through and we propose rates that were within the value of the formula, not beyond it.
I think I'm hearing the funding is probably going to follow the demand, but picking up Susan's point, there's no capacity for those parents who can get funding. They're legally, I think, entitled to have that funding, and they can't actually get somewhere for their kid to go. Is the local authority under any
I think what we need to not do is preempt the sufficiency planning that needs to take place. So there are pressures in areas. So it's not every area is the same. Similarly with the schools place planning, and so there will be areas with greater capacity than others. And the different sectors are able to respond to the level of demand, and that's part of the reason we're having additional sessions separately with those sectors, because as yet the maintained school sector have relatively little places available for that age group, and some schools are quite interested in developing that provision in their schools. There is physical capacity, and so there's something about providers stepping up and stepping into that space and being supported to do so. So that with any substantial change to an offer that comes in relatively quickly, if you think about when the government's announcements came through and the speed with which they're rolling out the different phases, there was bound to be some challenge around capacity and sufficiency. And so that's something the early years and early help service will be working with providers to respond to.
And I guess also it's a supply and demand to some, so some of that will be around demand for particular provisions and over demand for particular provisions rather than a capacity issue overall, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And bearing in mind that the childcare offer, so the free entitlement is unlikely to meet the overall childcare need of a working family. And so the capacity issues are in some regards more complex than schools place planning, because you're providing for a child who we got a statutory requirement to provide for. They have to be in school legally, and they're there full time. The early years entitlements are different to that, and so it's a bit more of a complex picture, and so it's something that needs to be properly planned for with providers, and that work is underway, not fully concluded, and different areas may need to respond differently to that and require different types of support.
I was just thinking, if I was the parent of a 2-year-old who got funding agreed and couldn't have previously afforded to have their young child in a provision, and then we weren't able to provide a provision because there were no settings for them, I would probably be less than thrilled with that. But you're saying that we don't know yet how big a problem that's going to be, and therefore let's deal with it.
I think to some extent it's not a debate for here. We do need to remember that the birth rates dropped off significantly, and the offer to parents has changed, and so there are different types of pressures as well as financial pressures and a whole host of things that will combine to create a context for the market to operate in. And so these aren't matters for Forum to really consider or decide on. I think the key thing is what you raised around the funding. the funding follows the children. The amount of funding we allocate out to providers will be based on participation. And in setting the formula, we don't anticipate that there will be a burden on the DSG, which is where this is funded from. If there was, that would be carried forward to a future financial year, and the early years funding formula would need to be set at a rate to recover that pressure and enable the block to be contained within the budget for early years going forward. So that would be the mechanism for dealing with the pressure if it arose. We wouldn't intend at this stage, and I doubt it would be agreed to cross-subsidise across different blocks, given the high needs blocks under pressure, schools are under pressure, and the schools funding formula is already set at a rate that allocates the entire block. So the block is intended to be self-contained.
Okay, good discussion. Thank you, everybody. Let's move on to high needs.
Okay, so the recommendations around the high needs. So the first recommendation around high needs is noting an update on a range of matters around high needs. So on Ealing's joint strategy for additional and special educational needs and disabilities, on outreach, on the way Ealing manage year 11 provision, and on SEND sufficiency and high needs deficit planning. So for the first couple of parts of that, I'm going to hand over to Madhu to take you through those areas.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So as you all know, we launched our strategy this time last year. So it's been live for a year. I'm just going to highlight some of the key points in the report. I don't want to read through everything and share some other updates with you. So with priority one, the key thing that's changed is that we've got 2 additional members of staff working within this priority, giving us more capacity to strengthen the work here. We've got a therapeutic thinking lead, and to date 49 schools have had therapeutic thinking, and actually the interest has been so good that we've had to put another session on in the summer term, and that interest has come from schools talking to other schools saying that you need to go onto it, which is fantastic. It's early days, but the signs where we compare schools where they've had therapeutic thinking training, suspensions are reduced compared to other schools, but very early days. We also have recruited to an access and inclusion lead, and he is working predominantly with secondary schools, supporting and challenging secondary schools around inclusive practice. Every school's signed up to an inclusion visit, which is fantastic. And that does include some schools that aren't part of ELP. So it shows that, you know, those relationships and partnerships are changing, which is fantastic. We also, through Ealing Learning Partnership, have started a peer review model, so pilot model. One of our head teachers from one of our local schools has been driving this for us, and the peer reviews took place just before the Easter holidays. So we're keen to see what the learning from that, and then we're hoping to roll that out with more schools. And the early years specialist teachers have increased the offer and training offer to early years providers within schools, teachers, leaders, Senkos, and in the summer term we've got a two-part session helping reception teachers to think about their provision in the summer term for September. So to really support the planning for the children that are coming in, to think about how we can make sure that transition period is good and that settling in period is good, and the sign up for that has been really excellent. I've had lots of head teachers telling me that that's, you know, a really good offer. So we'll see what the impact of that is in the autumn term. Oh, sorry. Okay. No. So the screen has gone. There we go. Oh, okay, there we go. Perfect. Preparing for adulthood. The thing I really want to share here actually is that we have improved our Preparing for Adulthood area on the local offer, and that was produced by young people with Harvey Duncan. It's really worth looking at, actually. It's something we're very proud of. And we now have a young people's social network. That's a group of 13 young people with additional needs. And they are, on Tuesday, we have our very first young people's conference, designed and led by young people with additional needs. There's many of us across the council, going along to that Tuesday. We're really, really proud. I mean, that's something that, you know, that we should all be very sort of pleased that we've been able to achieve and support. And I'm sure we'll come back to you with the findings of that conference, because I'm sure we'll be challenged in, there's a few areas they want to talk to us about: leisure, safety, schools, so the topics that they've chosen that they want to share their views and feedback on. And then with priority 3, this time last year, our timeliness was at 23%. That's timeliness for EHCPs. We finished the year at 83%. And currently we are at, I want to say 90, I did write it down, 99.2%, which is, you know, phenomenal. But, you know, that's taken a lot of work from the team. And we're very proud of that. Obviously, within that, we need to think about capacity. We all know that we're struggling with EPs at the moment, and they're crucial and part of this process. So we're doing a lot of work with HR around how we can reach out to EPs sort of nationally to try and get them into Ealing, so we can maintain the good work that's been happening. We've carried out multi-agency case audits. We've had 3 of those sessions, focusing on children known to social care to start off with. And that's been fantastic in terms of understanding what's working well for our children and young people, but also what we could be doing better, and building those relationships across our partnerships. Quality assurance of plans, a lot of training around outcomes and how to write good quality outcomes. We have speech and language therapy now are quality assuring every plan that goes out. So they're looking at that before it goes to our echoes. So there's been a real shift in terms of the commitment to ensuring that outcomes on plans improve. We've also got improved place planning, sort of data and information, and I'm sure Paul and hopefully other colleagues who have these conversations with the SENAS team can say that the conversations around place planning are stronger, more robust. And this leads into our sufficiency in terms of placements. We have a specialist working group that meets regularly, and that's made up of local authority officers and school officers, really unpicking and considering how we can increase provision across the local authority. And we're in active conversations with a few schools and governors around developing specialist resource provisions. Then when we come to outreach, just wanted to share some of the impact.
Just wondered, should we ask if there's any, it's a lot of information to absorb.
Sorry.
Anybody got any comments, questions on the update on the strategy?
One question on timeliness. What is deemed timely?
20 weeks.
20 weeks from the point of requesting.
That was an action from the last local area inspection around timeliness. There's been significant move forward.
Excuse me, can I just check that people online can hear in the Zoom meeting, because I've had a few messages.
Yes, I can hear. It does break up at times, but generally I can hear okay. This is Mia Pye.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, Madhu, do you want to move on to outreach?
Of course. So coming on to outreach, I've sort of outlined there some of the outreach offers that we've been working on this year, but to share some of the impact. So the team have supported to avoid 37 placement breakdowns and 14 permanent exclusions over the last year. With our Senko hotline, we've had over 200 consultations, and 13 of our new Senkos this year have had bespoke support. So that includes a training offer, but also bespoke support, individual sort of coaching and mentoring, if you like. And just to sort of give an understanding of some of the impact of that, as well as developing confidence, just in the last term, 5 of our children moved to a full-time education from reduced timetables. So all the children that we know of that are on reduced timetables, we asked Sam, who runs the consultation line, to work with those schools and work with members of staff to think about how we can increase those timetables. And just in the last term, 5 children have increased. So I think that's really positive. Last year we tried something new, where we offered dyslexia training and outreach for schools. It's a 3-part training program. Schools came together to get training delivery and then some bespoke sessions 45 schools signed up to that, and that includes our secondary schools as well. And feedback from that is it's all not data based, but in terms of confidence, in terms of how teachers are thinking about learning needs when rather than thinking about SEMH needs or thinking about behaviour, it's more actually is this coming from a learning need, which I think is fantastic. And then we've had some targeted support for some of our children. It's 20 children that have had targeted support. And within our SEND EFSPA, our Family Schools Partnership Award, linked to SEND, so it was a new piece of work that we did. 23 schools have been part of it and part of the training. And they've said that the confidence has risen from 4.5 to 8.9 out of 10 for those schools that have been involved in the training. And we're hoping to continue that and roll that out and to develop that further.
Okay.
I think that's most of the things I want to say. I'm going to stop now. Yes.
I think, the man beside that man, John Hicks, has got a question.
You'll know the answers, John.
Thanks. Madhu, I was just wondering about needs analysis for further outreach support and whether there are any gaps that have been identified and if that was something that was in progress at the moment.
Thank you, John. Yes, absolutely. So the Ealing Learning Partnership SEND and Inclusion Committee have been doing some work around what outreach is available, what the gaps are, what we need to look at. We've also, in our Senko network, had a conversation with Senkos about that as well, what they would like, how they would like to access the offers as well, so we can make it more equitable, and how we make sure that all schools are aware of the offer and what's there for them. So absolutely, and in the summer term, we'll be doing more of that work. I'll be back in my ELP role, so there'll be a bit more capacity for me to be able to really unpick that with the committee and with Senkos and with schools and to refine our offer to schools. Yes, thank you, John.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the intention would be to report back to Forum at the July meeting on the kind of progress of some of that work.
So we'll move on to the year 11. Are you taking that, Kim, or is that it?
Before we get to that bit, covered and sort of sequentially within the report, we'll cover the SEND sufficiency and high needs deficit recovery planning section. So this big section begins on page 9, at the bottom of page 19. So there's a little bit of information there about the increases in plans. I think we're all fairly excited on the fact that plans are continuing to increase at pace at a faster rate than funding is increasing. So based on the high forecast scenario, which we think is the most likely kind of trajectory for the next 3 years, it creates a significant challenge in terms of the provision of sufficient places. Plans forecast to increase by a further 700 to nearly 4,400 over the next 3 years. The current position in terms of the high needs block, so we'll report that to the June meeting, that there is a deficit on the high needs block. I mean, early indications are the actions around sustainability, value for money, combined with the fact there was additional high needs block funding in 23-24 from the autumn 22 statement, have sort of limited the increase in that overspend and we remain in a stronger position than many other London boroughs, a lot of whom are already in safety valve or delivering better value programmes, but it's becoming increasingly challenging. I mean, we've got a known increase in the block of 2.4% for 24-25. We're anticipating, and the information from the DfE is that the increases that we'll see in the high needs block are going to be lower than we've seen in recent years. There wasn't any additional funding announced in the autumn 23 statement. So the forecasts are that the deficit is going to escalate substantially over the next 3 years. Forum will be required to make a decision around the management of any surplus or deficit in respective DSG blocks at the June meeting. And the local authority are likely to once again propose, as we have done over the recent years, that Forum approve the use of any reserves to mitigate the high needs block deficit, as well as pressures relating to future school organisation changes. So that will come to the June meeting for a decision. As Madhu alluded to, we're obviously creating local specialist places is a crucial part of reducing the forecasted deficit. So we're working closely with schools around developing options around that. The current delivery programme provides 2 further secondary specialist resource provisions and an additional 130 special school places compared to the September 22 baseline, but our sort of modelling around that is that we need an additional 500, up to an additional 500 places by 2028. So that only goes, the current delivery plan and plans only go part of the way towards that. So we're having conversations with mainstream schools who have surplus accommodation that may be suitable for specialist provision, and also with special schools in the borough to progress proposals to develop provision around satellites, etc. So that works ongoing. Alongside that work of creating specialist places, the sort of collaboration between schools, making the best use of our existing provision, and sort of cost avoidance around early help, prevention, and some of the other areas that Maddie's been talking around, the priorities for the strategy, are all sort of crucial parts of containing that deficit as best we can.
Has anybody got any questions around sufficiency?
Just around the top-up funding arrangements, I remember whether, I can't remember if last year or the year before, we were talking about not just looking at the level descriptors, but at the actual funding rates, which haven't changed in a very long time, but people's salaries have changed quite substantially over that same period. Because with complete respect and love for the people who are doing these things, the feeling in schools is not that of this report. So I know that things are happening, and I know things are progressing, and I know lots of work is happening, but that's still not what schools feel, right? Schools still feel really, really under pressure with all of this. And I mean, I can't speak for special schools, but I definitely can speak from a mainstream school perspective. And I know that, there's a feeling that more places are required, the deficit's increasing. These level descriptors have changed in such a way, or are changing in such a way, that children who used to receive a maximum top-up of 18 and change are now on 13 or 10. Maybe, and is that a behind the scenes, we're trying to save a bit of money because more plans are coming through? I mean, I'm not suggesting anyone's, there's a conspiracy, but do you know what I mean? Like the feeling in schools is that there is a greater need than ever. That level of need is being under-resourced by the government and then locally because we don't have a lot of money. And looking at something like year 11 provision, well, I mean, we probably need an early years provision that's, for children who are coming in with an extreme level of need, but getting a moderate level of funding that the school is then funding off of its own back, in a situation where, my budget has gone up this year by 1.8%, but my costs have gone up by 11. So I think that's what schools are feeling, right? It's not just send, it's the whole picture that,
So I think in broad response to that, part of the reason why it's really important that Madhu provide an update around the strategy is that the deficit recovery doesn't happen as a separate activity outside of the strategy. The strategy is the deficit recovery. If we have the resources at the right time, the right place for those children, they may or may not need a plan. If we have appropriate training for staff, recruitment and retention, various other things, those things will lead to us managing our high needs block effectively as a byproduct of having good quality local provision. In terms of the specific question around funding, there is an update. So come skipping forward, and we can go back to year 11 in case anyone has any particular questions. So in the report, we provide an update around the top-up funding arrangements for special schools and additionally resource provision. Special schools is a continuation from the 23-24 funding arrangements. You'll note the report provides an update on moving to a different model for resource provision for in mainstream schools. And so there's been an increase in funding for resource provision in mainstream, and the top-ups are set out in the report. And then it goes on to talk about, on page 24, the intention that we will be working with mainstream schools over the course of the next academic year, beginning in the summer term in earnest, to review the descriptors and levels of need in mainstream schools, and following on from that, we'd be looking at the funding arrangements. Now, there isn't a limitless pot of funding. After the previous stages, special schools resource provision, that has resulted in an increase in funding. and a more transparent way of allocating that funding across schools, so people understand the funding mechanisms, that the funding is equitable across schools for children with the same need. So one school isn't getting more for a child with very similar levels of need requiring similar resources. At the moment, there's a lack of clarity in mainstream. I think we fully accept that mainstream top-ups have not increased with inflation, salary inflation, but what has also happened is that there have been arrangements in place for one-to-one support and various other things that have made the arrangements more opaque, and that work needs to be done with schools. So what we're aiming to do is do the work with schools. It's a really significant commitment from the local authority, and we're hoping that schools will engage with that project as well. Maddie's service is intending to go out to schools to set up a working group. And so there are some interest. If there are interest from members on forum, please do express your interest to Maddu. And we will be providing an update through schools consultative group as well. What I'd ideally like to avoid is 40 schools being on the working group, because I think we'd struggle to make progress. So we're looking for terms of reference, a group of schools, and then ongoing engagement with the quadrants. What has happened across the previous sectors is moderation work to look at existing funding arrangements, existing banding levels, and a move towards a new model. We are not going to know what that looks like until we understand the lay of the land, because we only have so much funding. And we need to justify any additional commitments to that funding, given it's likely to increase the overall deficit. So that is the way we're proposing to address, to the extent we feel possible, the gap in funding versus need levels of demand in school from a resources perspective, which is the purpose of forum. So that's why that little paragraph's in there. But through the working group, we're looking to refine what that means, what a transition to a different model would look like, what schools would find it most helpful to prioritise, and what the key issues with current arrangements are. We think we broadly know. We have a panel that decides on those arrangements or contributes to decisions with local authority officers. So we have a good kind of broad understanding of how the funding arrangements are impacting schools, but we want to work that through for a discrete project. So hopefully there's some reassurance in that, and I think we're a lot further forward than we were, and the intention is to, as far as possible, move to a new arrangement from 25-26. However, if we're not able to work through the programme quickly enough, we are not going to rush to implement something from April. We need to make sure that it's fair and equitable, there's clear justification for any additional funding. And so that programme will be refined with schools, so we all have an understanding about the timescales and what our commitments to delivering that will be. Because there are, I think, perhaps Paul, Ian, colleagues who have participated in the programme today, there is a commitment school side to moderation, contributing to scripters, being consulted in information. So it's commitment from both parties.
And I think it's important to note that part of it kind of has to happen first before the funding kind of follows that part of it. So the development of the scriptures and the moderation is the first step around that, and then the funding comes afterwards rather than the other way around.
But you're talking about reallocating existing funding in a better, but different, but hopefully a better way, but doesn't alter the fact that the total pot remains the same. Is that true? My understanding, in fact, it's more of a question. I've realised I don't really understand how DFE funds local authority. So we know, you know how many mainstream kids there are at different levels, you know how many special needs there are, you know how many EHCPs there are. But if EHCPs are legal documents, if we have 1,000 more EHCPs than we used to have, does the government should take some responsibility for that? For mainstream, it's slightly more difficult.
Yeah.
But the reality is, either we say these children deserve to have EHCPs, but we can't afford it, so we won't give it to them, which feels very unattractive to me, particularly as a parent of one with an EHCP. But yeah, it's difficult to know. There's an element of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as the things start sinking, and all we do is try to make it look more attractive than we would have made if we hadn't done all the good things that we're doing, like Mary's spoken about, which is great. But it doesn't fix the problem. I think it's Jeremy's point. There isn't enough money, and we know that. But I don't know, which bits have more sway with trying to get more funding in, because clearly a lot of it they don't really care much about.
Could I just jump in here? Just two things. I do think that the local authority, I've shared the same concerns as Jeremy, and I've discussed it with colleagues, and I have found recent responses really helpful in understanding better the elements, particularly around the OPU elements. And I think if they were made a bit more clear, it would help the understanding, because it certainly helped my understanding. And I think that that will form part of the planning group and the descriptor level work group to really understand and drill down on those elements. I think that will be informative. The second thing that I would say is don't go back to first base. We've been through 3 years of this descriptor level project, and some of the elements and descriptors can be carried into the mainstream model so that we galvanize and work efficiently. Ours was, to some people it was a blessing, to some people it was torturous. And in order to make it efficient and clear, I think we should take what we've learned. And I think, so what I'm saying is I think there is an opportunity to move quite quickly into a better model and a more transparent model. But what I am saying also is the previous point. I think I understand and a bit more reassured about mainstream top-up allocations than I previously had been.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point. I think through both the special school and the special resource provision descriptor projects, it has become clear that there is a different levels of understanding in terms of the different elements of the funding and the way the funding works. So absolutely, I think it is really important that that's part of sort of improving the understanding of that is a part of the project. Ian, in answer to your question about if you get 1,000 more plans, do you get more funding? The answer is no. So the way the DFE funding model works, it isn't driven by the number of plans that you have or the number of children on SEND support. It's driven by other kind of proxy factors. So it's around it's driven by partly driven by population, partly driven by proxy factors such as deprivation. Part of it is driven by the number of children that we have in special schools, and so there's an element of it that's driven by the number of children we have in both state-funded and independent special schools, but it's not driven by the number of children with SEN. It's the kind of these sort of proxy factors, which to a lesser or greater extent do have correlated with numbers of plans. But yeah, it's very difficult because, as I say, that funding level, and also Ealing, because of previous funding arrangements, we're sort of what they call a floor authority in terms of the funding arrangements. So we're not seeing the levels of increase because of the way the model works. We're not seeing the levels of increase that some boroughs are, or some local authorities are, due to historic kind of funding arrangements in the way that model works. So sorry.
Okay, any other comments? And otherwise we'll.
Yeah, I just want to check. We were talking about learnings. Are other councils sharing best practice with Ealing and vice versa that we can learn from?
I think that's a very good point, Mike. I think other councils would perhaps want to learn from Ealing about our good practice, because I think despite the note of desperation in Jeremy's voice, which I share and which we all share, and which I think our colleagues share, the more and more that I look at it, the more and more I kind of admire the way Ealing is managed in the high needs block. That's not to say that I'm not going to have my fallouts with my colleagues here, but I have to say Ealing is stellar in how it's managed in an awful situation.
Yes, in terms of, thank you, Paul. In terms of learning, so there is a session for coming up in the next few weeks, which is a LA sort of SEN finance session, which includes some learning from local authorities who've been through Safety Valve and who've been through delivering better values. So some of that learning, and I think in May, there's some information coming out from the department, particularly around the learning from the delivering better values. So there is some of that learning is starting to be shared around those areas. I mean, a lot of the areas that boroughs in those programs have worked through are things that we've already kind of worked through in Ealing, but it'll be interesting to see what comes out of those sessions. In terms of other learning from other boroughs, in terms of a rollout of a funding model. So our new AD for SEN and Inclusion begun. It started on Monday, and I think she's been through in her previous authority a review of the funding arrangements and mainstream topics. So hopefully there'll be some learning from Aretha coming in as well around that. And yeah, we do kind of have conversations and share with other colleagues around what things they.
So there's a London network for finance leads. There are networks for assistant directors for SEN. Within the Safety Valve and delivering better value programs, there are also examples of funding models. We share regionally, so we have meetings with our neighbouring boroughs, and so we understand the funding arrangements in each of our boroughs, and a number of them are undertaking similar pieces of work. The context of each borough, while there are national arrangements and national guidance, each borough has quite a unique way of operating its top-up arrangements, how it commissions placements, and so it's not fully translatable across boroughs. So there's no one-size-fits-all model, which is ultimately where the government has indicated it would like to take kind of high needs funding descriptor of need 2. We're quite a long way away from that. So we're in the intervening period. It's important that Ealing has an updated approach, because it's been a very large number of years before anything was done in this regard, probably since, you know, the beginning of the initial SEN reforms in 2014 time. So there's learning from other boroughs, but there's no kind of gold standard that we can go to that we can just replicate and copy. We need to work with schools and co-produce an approach that will work for schools in the context of Ealing.
Thank you.
And can I just add to that? I think something that we just need to make everyone aware of, what I think is really good in Ealing, is that we are, from my sort of research and working with other local authorities and finding out what they're doing, what we do in Ealing is that we are working as a partnership. So with our level descriptors, it wasn't just schools and local authority officers, it was our EPs, our speech and language therapists, our OTs, you know, it's really everybody involved. And I think that's, in terms of learnings and people learning from us, I think that's what I've noticed that we do really well here compared to other local authorities that are on sort of similar journeys. So yeah, just to make that point, I think it's really important.
I mean, I think one of the issues that materially affects schools, not only in terms of sufficiency, but in terms of volume coming through, and it clearly has bearing on the local authority. But the one area that I would really love to see movement on is administration, because administration is choking the lifeblood out of schools with regards to particularly schools who have large numbers of EHC plans. And, you know, it's becoming one of the fallouts of the increase in numbers of sufficiency is the amount of administration that goes with maintaining those plans. And that's where there's a real block in the system. But I think we could talk about that endlessly. I think, Wendy, do you want to?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, lovely. Yes, I just want to reel it back slightly from, there's been a lot of talk about learning from other boroughs. And I appreciate the people sitting around the table, a lot of the people there tend to be head teachers. So obviously I'm coming from a governor's perspective. What would be really helpful for me, because so many years into this, I'm still scrabbling to understand a lot of it, is if you could give us examples of learning from other boroughs, and also just general examples of how Ealing, which I'm sure Ealing is doing incredibly well, how Ealing does actually match up to other boroughs so that we can visualise the difference. It would be a huge help.
Thanks, Wendy. We'll note that in the minutes and try to do something on it.
Thank you.
Well, I know it's an important subject for everybody. Anybody, sorry, moving on to the year 11.
Yeah, so the final item that we wanted to cover within today's forum meeting is around the way Ealing manages year 11 provision. So provision for in-year arrivals during year 11. So in Ealing, for a significant period of time, year 11 in-year arrivals applying for a school place are offered an alternative provision, providing both either an ESOL or a GCSE pathway, commissioned largely through West London College, with a smaller number of places placed at West Thames College on a as and when basis. As these placements are considered alternative provision, there's no funding through the schools block for that comes through the schools block for those children. They're required to be funded through the high needs block, and the annual cost of that in 23-24 was £0.65 million. So it's quite a significant draw on the high needs block. We've done some work understanding what happens with that cohort of children in neighbouring boroughs and other West London boroughs. And that work has shown that our Ealing's model, which has been in place for for a large number of years now, differs from other West London boroughs. So in majority, all other West London boroughs, the majority of year 11 arrivals are placed in high schools, either via in-year admissions or via fair access panel. So there are some smaller alternative provision arrangements in place in some of those boroughs, but the majority of those children are going into mainstream high schools rather than having a separate alternative provision that's funded through the high needs block. And if these students were placed on mainstream schools, there would, not all of them, but the children placed before census would attract additional funding through the schools block, which currently is not received because those children are in an alternative provision. So the reason for bringing this to forum, this is not a decision for forum to make. So matters around spending allocation of the high needs block are matters for the local authority, but we're bringing it to forum in the context of understanding some of the pressures on the high needs block, and asking forum to note that in planning for September 2025, the local authority, so led by Adam, the head of access and inclusion, and in sort of meeting its duty to both meet the needs of these children, but also make effective use of the high needs block and of best use of the high needs block and public funds, will be working with high school heads to undertake an assessment of the provision that we currently have in place, what the appropriate provision is to meet the needs of those children, while supporting strong outcomes and making the sort of appropriate use of the high needs block. So it's just coming to forum as an item for noting, and then will be a more substantial item for taking forward with the high school heads in the coming months.
Mia?
Hello. So I have a question around this. I appreciate it's to be discussed further with high school heads, but I'm just wondering if there's been any work that's been done in advance of this discussion, or if there will be any work done in advance of the discussion with the colleges themselves who are providing this provision, to look at the funding arrangement and to look at the costs and what appears to be a block booking that we're committed to.
So that work's ongoing. So with West London College, we have a service level agreement and funding arrangements which are reviewed annually. And so that's an ongoing piece of work and part of our commissioning arrangements with that provider. And similarly with West Thames College, we commission those places and negotiate on price per place on an ad hoc basis. So that work happens. We have a good understanding of the nature of the provision that's being offered. And so that will form part of the information that will be provided to high schools in terms of developing discussions of what alternative options or arrangements might be appropriate. may or may not be appropriate, and that will kind of inform any proposal for remaining with the existing model or a proposal for an adjustment at a future date. Does that
Okay,
answer the question? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. But I had another question, sorry. And has there been any consideration, because it may just be the wording in the report, but it appears to come across as it's either college or mainstream secondary schools. I wonder if there'd been any consideration given, or will there be any consideration given to using what is obviously quite a substantial amount of money to develop our own alternative provision in some way. We obviously do have an Ealing alternative provision, and whether there's been any consideration to this amount of funding or perhaps less funding being used there in a way that could perhaps be a little bit more, how can we put it, efficiently used, because it's a setting we've already got set up to accommodate this. Are those sorts of options being looked at? Because as I said, it just comes across in the report currently that it's an either or model for colleges or mainstream schools.
So I think that's all on the table for discussion. I think it's likely if we do move towards a school based model for some parts of it, there'll always be the need for alternative provision for part of that cohort, and whether that's through college or through a designated alternative provision for children with additional needs, that would need to be worked through understanding the data around that cohort. A large proportion of the cohort are ESOL students without identified educational needs outside of some of the challenges that may present, and so that detail will be provided and discussed with Adam, and I'm sure there'll be further lines of inquiry opened at a point you have an initial discussion that he'll be able to take away. So I think probably what to expect in the initial conversation will be a briefing around the information we have available about the current state of affairs, current arrangements, and then a discussion with high school head colleagues around next steps. What additional information do we need to be able to make this decision? What do alternative models look like in other areas? And what does the data around the outcomes for those young people tell us about what the provision needs to look like going forward?
Okay, thank you.
Could I just follow up? Oh, sorry. Go.
Roshi?
Hi, yes, just to follow on, and maybe Tamara, you've already answered this, but it would be interesting for head teachers to know the impact data on those young people who are currently at the college doing those courses. And I would have a concern in some way, but I'm sure this will be discussed later, that a large number of the secondary schools are full anyway, which would mean that some of our schools that aren't full would end up having these children, and we already fill those places with children within your admissions when they're empty, etc. So, we're putting more challenge on schools that are potentially struggling at the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roshi. Ian?
Can you just let me know how many, you say it's 650K in cost. Is that for 90 places, or is that for up to 90 places? How many are we actually paying for? And because if it's 90, it's £7,220 per student. So I'm assuming they're mainstream primarily. What's the maintained high school funding level for a mainstream year 11 student?
So
I just don't know the answer.
So it's not too out of kilter from that, but the issue is that because these children are in an alternative provision, for a high school, that funding comes through the schools book.
Oh, I accept the funding route is different, but the underlying cost is broadly the same.
Yeah, but also for the block contract, we're paying for places that aren't filled for a period of time, because we need to guarantee, we need to be able to offer a place later on in the year, and we offer places right up until the end of the spring term, I think it is, something along those lines, so really late in the year, because what you may find is a family has moved and there is a child that has had a UK education and has been preparing for GCSEs that then subsequently doesn't have a school place when they arrive at the borough. So there are a number of children where that is the case, and potentially college isn't appropriate. So there's a broad range of children with additional needs, complex and challenging behaviour, where AP may be appropriate, but there will also be young people, particularly with the housing crisis and the level of temporary accommodation that our families are experiencing, who absolutely would thrive in a mainstream high school environment. And so we need to understand the data around that, prevalence, as you suggest, Roisin. The capacity to be able to meet those needs is also important. And clearly we'd need to make sure that a high school who is admitting will be able to operate. What currently happens is high schools don't declare vacancies in year 11. There are vacancies in year 11. There are more vacancies than 90 in year 11 across schools. So I think it's just something to be mindful of. It's not to suggest this entire cohort should be in high school or could thrive in high school. It's a discussion that needs to happen, and a proposal would be put forward once those discussions have happened.
To have an alternative is good, but it does feel, from what you just said, actually, that we could probably get more placements into an existing high school provision.
And I think
still have some backup if we needed it. And I was just worried that we were spending on, say, 90 places, but for half the year we weren't using 90 places. But maybe at the end of the year, as you say, Tamara, that it builds. It would be useful to see some profiling, perhaps, of say the last 12 months.
And that will be part of the discussions with high school. But that level of detail would not tend to come to forum. That would be part of the detailed discussions that would happen with the high school.
But I think what's to talk about the different funding routes. I think what's important for forum members to note is that if where the children are in maintained schools, that's for the children that are there by census day, which is a significant proportion, not all, but of the children, the funding follows the child through the schools block, albeit on a lagged basis. Whereas with the high needs block, there's no funding that follows the fact that there's that number of children. So whether you do or don't use alternative provision, the funding from the high needs block is the same.
Well, the high needs block's under such pressure to try and do a little bit more to minimise what we use in that area and put it through the mainstream system would seem better, but I accept it's not perfect. Thank you.
Jeremy?
I do have a question, but Charlotte has a hand.
Oh, Charlotte. Sorry, Charlotte, did you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And apologies if I'm repeating it, but it would be really interesting to see a breakdown of the analysis of the reasons for arrival of those young people in our borough, and also the provision that they go on to. Certainly that would help us to think about the pathways for those young people. So I come from another West London borough previously, and ESOL was a really important part of ensuring a pathway for the future. So I suppose whilst I recognise that the purpose of forum is only to say that this is coming, it would be really helpful to use this forum to say that data and analysis and specifics about the models from other boroughs, all of that would help to strengthen the review that the borough will go on to do moving forward. Thank you.
I think, yeah, it's a really good point, Charlotte. I think that the detail is something that possibly Kim and Tamara will work up with the high schools. And then as a result of those conversations, that sort of will be captured in any decisions that forum needs to make going forward. It's kind of, I suppose, it's the level of detail, which is important, but it's mainly for high schools. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jeremy?
I mean, I don't believe I have a clear grasp of all of this. So, but what it sounds like sounds ethically questionable, and I would struggle to support giving money from like the 0.5% that we transfer to the high needs block. I would struggle to support that, knowing that 650 grand of it is going to this, because I'm wondering when the provision is going to come into place for year 6 children that arrive in my school in time for SATs that I haven't had time to educate, or when they arrive in year 5 and I've had 8 months with them. So I don't clearly understand all of this. I don't understand why when these children arrive, they're not put into high schools in our local authority, but it sounds unethical. And I would struggle to support a transfer from the block if this is what we're spending money on.
I think there are a range of questions about how and why this provision is our current offer. And I think that's a question that will be part of the discussions with the high school heads group, but it's an important understanding for all heads and decision makers, and that's why it's part of this report. So primarily, we're discussing this with you because it has a funding implication that is reasonably complex in terms of the census and the funding arrangements and how that will work its way through and whether we're funded or not for these children. But ultimately, the reason that Adam Brazier, the Head of Access and Inclusion, is leading this piece of work with support from Kim and I is that ultimately it's an alternative provision and we need to make appropriate provision that we should be able to feel confident is ethical and is clearly articulated to those families who arrive in the area.
I'm coming from a slightly different approach, and I wasn't going to mention it because it's kind of got rather complicated, and I'm sure people have had enough. But what I was interested in, and maybe I'm being naive in this, is the sentence where it says, if these students were placed on a mainstream school role, a significant number would attract additional funding via the school block. And it's as if it's saying there's a pot of money that we could be attracting, but we're not attracting.
Exactly what it's saying.
So it would it not make financial logic to?
It would. I think what the reason that it's brought here is for exactly that reason. Ultimately, this work may progress and there may be a range of options on the table, and it may be proposed that actually this is the most appropriate provision and these children are able to thrive and it's an appropriate use of resources. So that could ultimately be the proposal at the end. And we are not preempting that, but it's important that we acknowledge that there are different models and that we review and consider what those might be and then make a decision about it.
Is Roisin first?
Yeah.
Roisin?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just wanted to make sure that I completely understand Tamara, because I think Paul mentioned that the decision would come later, but initially you said that it wasn't a decision for Forum.
Yeah, that's right. Apologies for the
Sorry, I need to apologise. I didn't mean decision. I meant the summary information from the discussion with the heads, secondary heads group. It's like a kind of you guys need to thrash this out, and then the outcome of that come
be
back to
shared.
Forum for information. Sorry, I'm rushing.
No problem. Thank you. Just clarification.
Mia, was that a historic hand?
Yeah, I had the same question. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Can I just ask, you've just confused me with this discussion about if it was going in, they were going into mainstream, additional funding would become available. I can understand main schools block funding would be used to pay for their education rather than high needs block, but it's not extra funding.
So we would attract additional funding. So those children
Isn't it a
will.
win-win to try and get
Possibly.
It possibly is, but it's important that there's a.
Sounds like
But if the outcomes for those children are impacted to an extent, you know, they aren't able to thrive, achieve GCSEs or whatever it is that we're seeking to achieve, there would be a challenge with just making that purely financial decision. So there is a financial context, and the decision making needs to be evidenced by what other boroughs do, what's expected, what we have to provide from a statutory perspective, thinking about the broader cohort within schools. So there are elements and maybe arguments around whether it's at the detriment to children that are attending the school to admit these children much later on in the year 11 year. And I'm sure that's a debate that will happen with those schools. So that is why Adam is leading the work, because it needs to be led from an access and inclusion perspective. And Kim and I will be supporting the work to do the financial modelling. And we're bringing it here for the reason that we are missing out on funding and we need to have a robust position around why that's reasonable.
What proportion of year 11 arrivals are we talking about?
All of them. So
That's what I
no
thought.
child arriving in year applying for a
Goes-
school place
N-
is
ever goes
allocated a
direct.
school place. They are currently being allocated a college place.
We're missing, so we have to fix this because it sounds broken. So let's wait and see what Adam comes up
More
with.
work to come on it.
Yeah.
I've got my hand up again. Is that all right? It's not historical now, it's me. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine, Mia.
Yeah, really, this is probably just more of a comment, really, just in summary from having heard what people have said, and sort of on the back of what Tamara's just said, is just not to preempt the high school heads discussion, but this is very much going to be, from our point of view, not so much about a financial decision. There are all sorts of factors regarding you know, from a student need perspective that we would need to consider with students coming into schools in year 11. You know, I'm not going to go into the detail now, but just the complexity of secondary school curriculums, for instance, means that you know, interesting sort of point raised by Jeremy about it being ethical, but it could well be that actually it's not ethical to have students in year 11 because it is such complex curriculum models, and you know, us getting students coming in and taking exams and that kind of thing when they haven't been adequately prepared for them can obviously be extremely problematic. So I just wanted to make the point that I know it's not for this meeting, but that discussion does need to go far beyond the realms of what seems to be financially efficient or sensible, even, you know, in inverted commas, because it is actually, it's the impact on those students that is the most important thing. And although it might seem in theory going into school would be the best decision, it's not actually that straightforward.
Thanks, Mia. I'm sure there'll be interesting discussions with the high school heads going forward. Oh, thank you very much, everybody. The date of the next meeting will be on the 10th of July. Bring your t-shirts and not your shorts, please, at the same time. And have a good evening, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.